Welcome to Sleep Documentary. Tonight, your life will begin as Quetzalcoatlus, the largest flying creature in Earth's history, with wings wider than a small airplane, ruling the skies above the age of dinosaurs. But what would it actually feel like to survive as a giant of the prehistoric world? From hatching inside a fragile egg to witnessing the final days before extinction. Before we begin, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. And thank you for being here. 68 million years ago, long before human beings would ever look up and imagine dragons in the clouds, the center of North America was a place that barely resembled the modern world. Vast floodplains stretched for hundreds of miles beneath a heavy subtropical sky. Rivers wider than cities moved slowly through forests of conifers and ancient flowering plants. The ground steamed after rainstorms. Insects hummed through dense vegetation taller than a grown elephant. And almost everywhere, something enormous was moving. Far in the distance, giant titanosaurs crossed the wetlands in slow-moving herds, each footstep sinking deep into mud that would someday harden into stone. Carnivorous dinosaurs followed the river systems like living shadows. Smaller predators hid beneath fern thickets, waiting for movement. The entire world seemed built around size. Bigger jaws, longer necks, heavier bodies. Survival often belonged to whatever could dominate space through sheer scale alone. But hidden above this brutal landscape was another kingdom entirely. The sky, and somewhere near the edge of a broad inland river, half buried beneath warm sediment and tangled vegetation, rested a cluster of eggs unlike anything in the modern world. One of them contained you. The shell surrounding your body was not thick like a bird's egg. Most paleontologists believe pterosaur eggs were softer, more leathery, closer in some ways to reptile eggs than the rigid shells associated with modern birds. That detail alone changes the entire feeling of your beginning. A hard shell can survive exposure. A softer shell demands moisture, protection, stability. Too much sunlight and the egg dries out. Too much water, and it rots. Too cold, and development slows dangerously. Too hot, and life ends before it starts. The place where your egg was laid mattered immensely. No one knows exactly how Quetzalcoatlus northropi nested. The fossil evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. Unlike some smaller pterosaurs discovered in large colony sites, Quetzalcoatlus left behind only fragments of its private life. Massive bones, isolated remains, a few clues hidden in ancient rock formations. Scientists can estimate its wingspan, debate its hunting style, even model how it may have launched into the air, but the details of reproduction remain strangely ghost-like. And maybe that uncertainty makes the scene feel more real, because nature rarely preserves ordinary moments. No fossil records the sound of wind moving through the reeds around your nest. No fossil explains whether your parents stayed nearby or disappeared shortly after laying the eggs. Some researchers suspect giant Ajdarchid pterosaurs, like Quetzalcoatlus, may have provided limited parental care. Others argue the hatchlings could have been surprisingly independent almost immediately after emerging, capable of crawling and perhaps even climbing shortly after birth. Both possibilities carry terrifying implications. If your parents stayed, they risked attracting predators to the nest itself. If they left, then survival began alone. The floodplain around you was not calm. It only appeared calm from inside the egg. Massive crocodilian predators drifted through nearby waterways. Small meat-eating dinosaurs moved constantly through the undergrowth, searching for exposed nests. Mammals existed too, though not yet dominant. Tiny nocturnal scavengers with quick movements and sharp teeth. Even insects posed danger. In warm prehistoric climates, decay moved quickly. Eggs left unguarded too long could disappear beneath swarming life before they ever had a chance to hatch. And above all of it stood the strange contradiction of your species. Quetzalcoatlus northropi may have been the largest flying animal in Earth's history. A creature with a wingspan potentially rivaling a small airplane. Yet your life began small enough to fit inside an egg, vulnerable to rainfall. That imbalance shaped everything. Modern people often imagine giant prehistoric creatures as invincible because fossils freeze them at maximum size. Museums display the fully grown versions, towering skeletons beneath dramatic lighting, bones stretched into permanent dominance. But almost no creature survives because it is born powerful. Most survive because enough offspring endure weakness long enough to reach adulthood. For Quetzalcoatlus, those early stages may have been extraordinarily dangerous. Your egg rests partially hidden beneath damp vegetation while storms roll across the floodplain. The climate of late Cretaceous North America could shift violently between wet and dry periods. Seasonal flooding may have transformed entire regions in days. Rivers changed direction. Mudflats disappeared underwater. Nesting grounds could become death traps almost overnight. A low vibration passes faintly through the ground. Something large is approaching. Not hunting, not searching for your nest specifically. That would almost make more sense. Predators can at least be understood. But the greatest danger to eggs on prehistoric floodplains may often have been accidental destruction. A giant herbivore crossing soft ground would never notice what lay beneath its feet. The earth trembles again. Somewhere outside the shell, colossal animals move through the fog-heavy morning like walking landscapes. You cannot see them yet, but the environment already shapes your future. The survival strategies of Quetzalcoatlus were likely tied to open spaces, broad visibility, and efficient movement across enormous distances. Even as an unborn hatchling, your species existed within a world where territory could stretch for hundreds of miles. Perhaps that helps explain the evolution of flight in such giants. Not simply escape, access. The ability to move between scattered resources across unstable prehistoric ecosystems. The egg shifts slightly as moisture gathers along its surface. Inside, your body is developing quickly. Pterosaurs grew differently from mammals, faster in some ways, more direct. Evidence from bone structure suggests many pterosaurs grew rapidly during early life stages, though exact growth rates remain debated for giant species like Quetzalcoatlus. Some scientists think these enormous azhdarchids may have reached flight capability relatively early compared to their total adult size. Others argue gigantic proportions required longer development. But regardless of timing, one reality remains unavoidable. If you survive long enough to fly, the world changes completely. Because the sky of the Late Cretaceous was unlike anything alive today. There were birds, yes. Early relatives of modern avian lineages already existed. Smaller, agile, feathered survivors slowly adapting toward the future. But pterosaurs still ruled the upper air in forms birds had never truly replicated, especially the azhdarchids. Long-necked, towering, built with proportions that still seem almost unreal. Standing on the ground, a mature Quetzalcoatlus may have looked upward at giraffe height while folding wings larger than many rooms. And yet, evolution had pushed your species toward strange fragility, too. The larger an animal becomes, the narrower its margin for error. A giant flyer cannot waste energy carelessly. Reproduction becomes slower. Population recovery becomes harder. Environmental collapse becomes more dangerous. In some ways, gigantism creates superiority for millions of years, right up until conditions suddenly change. Outside your nest, the floodplain grows quieter. That can be worse than noise. Predators rarely announce themselves for long. A small dromaeosaur-like hunter emerges cautiously through the vegetation, scanning for movement. Feathers ripple along its narrow body as it pauses near the nesting ground. It is intelligent by prehistoric standards, fast, curious, constantly searching for vulnerable life stages rather than challenging adult giants directly. That strategy works remarkably well in nature. Most predators do not attack the strongest version of an animal. They attack the unfinished version. The hunter lowers its head toward the soil. For a moment, everything depends on concealment. And concealment may have been one reason Quetzalcoatlus eggs remain so mysterious today. Soft-shelled eggs fossilize poorly, open nesting grounds erode, entire generations vanish from the geological record without leaving clear evidence behind. What survives are fragments, suggestions, hints scattered across deep time. In a strange way, your species is partly reconstructed through absence. Scientists know Quetzalcoatlus existed because certain bones survived. Immense cervical vertebrae, hollow limb structures, wing elements engineered by evolution into astonishing lightweight strength. But the daily experience of these creatures remains partially hidden behind speculation. Did hatchlings chirp? Did adults recognize offspring visually? Did mating pairs remain together seasonally? No one truly knows. The dromaeosaur freezes suddenly. A deeper vibration rolls through the floodplain. then another. The predator retreats instantly into the ferns. Even among hunters, fear travels fast. Through gaps in the vegetation, an enormous shape passes beyond the nesting ground. Not a tyrannosaur, something even larger in pure mass. A massive herbivorous dinosaur moving slowly beside the riverbank, stripping vegetation with mechanical efficiency. Insects scatter around its feet. Birds rise briefly into the humid air before settling again. The world outside your egg is already crowded with giants. And somehow, one day, you are expected to rise above all of them. The idea sounds impossible. Yet evolution had already been solving impossible problems for hundreds of millions of years before Quetzalcoatlus ever existed. Hollow bones compensated for size. Air sac systems may have reduced body density. Powerful forelimbs potentially allowed explosive quadrupedal launches into the air. Every part of the body became a negotiation between gravity and survival. But none of that matters yet, because first you have to hatch. And even that may be harder than it sounds. The warm floodplain darkens beneath distant storm clouds. Rain begins softly at first, tapping against leaves overhead. Water seeps slowly into the nesting ground. Somewhere nearby, thunder rolls across the ancient interior of North America. Inside the egg, your body shifts for the first time with real force. Tiny claws press against the leathery shell. The outside world waits in darkness beyond a membrane thinner than paper. And hidden somewhere far above the storm clouds, beyond every river and forest and dinosaur-filled plain below, an asteroid is already moving silently toward Earth. Rainwater drips slowly through the dense prehistoric vegetation above your nest, while the shell around you continues to soften under pressure. The world outside has already been alive for hundreds of millions of years, but your entire existence still fits inside a cramped chamber no larger than a modern backpack. Every movement now feels urgent. Your body twists awkwardly against the leathery membrane, hind limbs pushing weakly through wet sediment, while your elongated jaw presses forward for the first real contact with open air. Then the shell tears. Warm humidity floods in immediately. For the first time, you see the late Cretaceous world not as distant vibrations through an egg, but as light, motion, heat, and scale. Everything is bigger than it should be. Towering cycads spread across the floodplain like miniature forests beneath larger forests. Insects with armored bodies crawl through mud thick with decaying plant matter. Massive dragonfly-like forms flicker through shafts of sunlight, cutting between branches overhead. Somewhere far away, something enormous bellows across the wetlands, low enough that the sound seems to vibrate inside your chest instead of your ears. You are born into one of the loudest ecosystems Earth has ever produced. And yet, at this moment, you are almost invisible. Your body is fragile enough that even the environment itself feels dangerous. The membrane of your wings clings damply against your sides, folded around a skeleton that still seems unfinished. The proportions already look strange. Your neck is long, your head oversized. One finger on each forelimb extends dramatically farther than the others, supporting the structure that will someday carry you across entire prehistoric continents. But right now, those wings are useless. That may be one of the strangest realities about Quetzalcoatlus. People often imagine giant flying animals beginning life already powerful, like miniature versions of the adults they will become. Fossil evidence suggests reality was likely far more uncomfortable. Hatchlings may have emerged surprisingly capable in some ways, but capability is not the same thing as mastery. You pull yourself free from the remains of the egg and collapse into wet vegetation. The nest around you is quiet. Too quiet. No giant parent descends from the sky. No enormous shadow spreads protectively overhead. If adult Quetzalcoatlus provided parental care, it may have been limited or inconsistent compared to modern birds. Some paleontologists suspect the young may have been relatively independent early in life, partly because flight demands extreme energy efficiency. Feeding and defending giant offspring across vast floodplains would have been enormously expensive biologically. But that interpretation remains debated. Some researchers argue creatures this large may have needed at least temporary protection during vulnerable growth stages. Others point toward pterosaur bone development, suggesting hatchlings could move effectively almost immediately after birth. The uncertainty creates an unsettling possibility. Maybe survival depended less on being protected and more on becoming useful quickly. You raise your head slightly above the mud. The world smells alive in every direction. Wet soil, rotting vegetation, river water, insects, animal musk, heat trapped beneath layers of dense greenery. The atmosphere itself feels heavier than the modern world, thick with moisture and movement. During the Late Cretaceous, carbon dioxide levels were likely much higher than today, contributing to warmer global climates and extensive ecosystems stretching across enormous regions of Earth. Life expanded aggressively in environments like this, which also meant death moved fast. A line of tiny insects is already crawling across the remains of your broken shell. Nothing stays unused for long here. You attempt your first steps carefully, balancing awkwardly on all four limbs. That detail alone would look bizarre to modern eyes. Quetzalcoatlus was not built like a bird. Its wings were extensions of the arms, supported primarily by an enormously elongated fourth finger. On the ground, it likely moved quadrupedally, using both forelimbs and hind limbs together in a highly specialized walking motion, unlike anything alive now. Even as a hatchling, the mechanics of your body belong to an evolutionary experiment with no true modern equivalent. Mud clings to the thin membrane stretching along your arms and torso. Tiny, hair-like pycnofibers cover parts of your body, giving insulation against temperature shifts. For years, many people imagined pterosaurs as leathery reptilian creatures with naked skin, but fossil discoveries from China and elsewhere revealed something stranger. At least some pterosaurs possessed filament-like body coverings that may have helped regulate heat, perhaps even hinting at a metabolism more active than older reconstructions once assumed. That changes the feeling of the animal entirely. You are not a sluggish reptile baking passively beneath the sun. You are alert, reactive, restless, and hungry already. The problem is that hunger itself creates danger. Movement attracts attention. The floodplain around the nesting ground seems endless, but much of it operates through hidden observation. Small predators search constantly for weakness, because weakness is easier than confrontation. Even giant carnivores prefer opportunity over risk whenever possible. Something moves nearby. You freeze instinctively. Through tall ferns, a small, mammal-like creature emerges briefly from beneath tangled roots. Tiny black eyes, fast breathing, sharp teeth adapted for crushing insects and scavenging soft material. It pauses only seconds before vanishing again into shadow. For now, you are too large for some threats, too small for others. That awkward middle ground may define the early life of Quetzalcoatlus more than flight ever did. The sky overhead flashes briefly with movement. You look up. Far above the floodplain, an adult pterosaur glides across rising air currents with almost impossible stability. The silhouette barely flaps. It simply adjusts position against the wind while sunlight catches along enormous wings stretched wider than many modern rooms. The scale is difficult to process. One day your species becomes that. But evolution does not care about potential futures. It only measures immediate survival. You continue moving through vegetation near the nest, legs trembling occasionally beneath your weight. Already your body shows hints of the proportions that will later dominate the sky. Long neck vertebrae, lightweight bones filled with air spaces, enlarged forelimbs engineered around future flight capability. Even your skull structure reflects a life built around reaching quickly, grabbing prey efficiently, and minimizing unnecessary mass. Nothing about Quetzalcoatlus was designed casually. Gigantic flight required ruthless efficiency in nearly every anatomical detail. That may explain why the hatchlings appear strangely vulnerable instead of heavily armored or muscular. Excess weight would eventually become catastrophic. Your species evolved toward lightness, not protection, toward mobility, not durability. And mobility takes time to develop. A distant rumble rolls across the wetlands. Storms again. The climate here changes violently. Sudden rainfall can transform dry ground into floodwater within hours. Nest placement mattered enormously because low areas became death traps almost immediately during heavy seasonal storms. Some scientists suspect pterosaurs selected elevated nesting grounds whenever possible, though exact nesting behavior for giant azhdarchids remains uncertain. You do not understand any of this consciously, but instinct pushes you toward firmer ground anyway. The vegetation thins slightly near a raised patch of sediment overlooking shallow water channels below. Small fish-like creatures break the surface occasionally, while insects hover above the murky current. Everything in the ecosystem seems connected through constant motion. Herds reshape vegetation. Rivers reshape terrain. Storms reshape rivers. Predators reshape herd behavior. And somewhere within that chaos, your species learn to survive by mastering distance itself. Perhaps that is why young Quetzalcoatlus may have developed rapidly. Some researchers studying pterosaur growth patterns have proposed that even relatively young individuals could potentially achieve flight sooner than expected. If true, that would change the entire survival strategy of the species. Instead of spending years defenseless on the ground like many birds, young pterosaurs may have escaped vulnerability earlier by becoming mobile in 3 dimensions. But early flight creates its own terrifying possibility. The first launch. Even adult Quetzalcoatlus faced enormous physical demands during takeoff. Modern biomechanical models suggest giant ashdarchids likely used powerful quadrupedal launches, vaulting themselves into the air using all 4 limbs, rather than relying solely on hind leg thrust like birds. The forelimbs may have acted almost like biological catapults. For a hatchling, though, those systems remain incomplete. You reach the edge of the elevated ground and stop. Below, muddy water moves slowly through the floodplain, while distant dinosaurs cross beneath heavy clouds gathering along the horizon. One group resembles armored living tanks covered in spikes and plates. Farther away, hadrosaurs move together through shallow wetlands, their calls echoing faintly through humid air. The world feels impossibly crowded, yet the sky above remains strangely open. That contrast may have shaped the psychological feeling of flight long before human beings ever imagined it. On the ground, prehistoric North America was packed with competition, danger, and obstacles. But above the floodplain stretched enormous, invisible highways of warm air capable of carrying giant animals across immense distances. The adults understood that world already. You do not. Not yet. Another sound interrupts the wetlands. Closer this time. Branches shift somewhere behind you. Your body lowers instinctively against the mud. A juvenile theropod emerges slowly from the vegetation, feathers twitching along narrow arms, while amber eyes scan the ground ahead. Not large enough to threaten adult giants, more than large enough to kill something your size. It pauses. The head tilts slightly. For a moment, neither of you moves. Then the predator steps forward carefully, and somewhere, deep inside your unfinished body, millions of years of evolutionary pressure suddenly converge into a single instinct, powerful enough to override fear. Run. You run before you understand what running even means. Mud explodes beneath your limbs as instinct drags your body forward through dense, prehistoric vegetation. Behind you, the juvenile predator crashes through the ferns with sudden bursts of speed, its feathered body weaving between roots and fallen branches with terrifying precision. Every movement reveals the same brutal truth shared by nearly all ecosystems across Earth's history. Most young animals die young. And for something built to rule the sky someday, your species begins life astonishingly close to the ground. Your wings drag awkwardly against wet plants, while your long forelimbs struggle to coordinate with your hind legs. the proportions still feel wrong, too stretched, too unstable. Evolution has designed your body around a future version of yourself that does not exist yet. Ahead, the terrain drops sharply toward a dry channel carved by seasonal floodwaters. You leap instinctively down the slope, half sliding through loose sediment while the predator hesitates above the incline for only a second before following. Then something changes. Wind. For the first time, air catches beneath the thin membrane stretching along your forelimbs. Not enough to fly, but enough to lighten you. You stumble forward another few yards before collapsing beside exposed roots near the edge of the dry channel. The predator stops above you now, staring downward with cold patience instead of immediate aggression. That hesitation matters. Hunting costs energy. Injury costs survival. Predators constantly calculate risk, even when pursuing weaker prey, and you no longer look entirely helpless. Your wings spread partially against the ground as you hiss sharply, throat vibrating with raw panic. The display is clumsy, but size itself already carries psychological power. Even juvenile Quetzalcoatlus possessed unnerving body proportions, long jaws, expanding wings, unnatural height for such a young creature. Evolution often weaponizes appearance long before physical strength fully develops. The predator studies you. Then, somewhere deeper in the forest behind it, another sound echoes through the floodplain. A larger carnivore. The juvenile theropod freezes instantly before retreating back into the vegetation without another movement toward you. And just like that, your life continues. Not because you fought, not because you were protected, because something worse existed nearby. That may have been one of the defining realities of late Cretaceous ecosystems. Survival often depended less on dominance and more on positioning yourself beneath the notice of truly catastrophic predators. Giant Azhdarchid pterosaurs like Quetzalcoatlus evolved inside a world crowded with tyrannosaurs, massive crocodilians, and unstable climates. Flight offered escape from some dangers, but before flight came vulnerability. You remain motionless beside the roots for several minutes while the floodplain slowly settles again into its endless background noise. Insects hum through warm air. Distant dinosaurs call across the wetlands. Wind moves through conifer branches overhead, while storm clouds continue building along the horizon. The world almost seems peaceful again, but something inside you has shifted permanently. The ground no longer feels safe. Over the following weeks, your body begins changing rapidly. Growth in pterosaurs may have occurred faster than many people expect, especially during early stages. Bone tissue from some pterosaur fossils suggests active growth rates closer to birds or mammals than slow-growing reptiles. For giant species, the details remain debated, but one thing becomes increasingly clear as you mature. Everything about your anatomy is preparing for launch. Your forelimbs lengthen noticeably. The enormous fourth finger supporting each wing expands farther with every passing stage of growth. Lightweight bones, reinforced internally by complex struts, begin handling increasing mechanical stress without adding unnecessary mass. Even your muscles develop differently from ground-based predators around you. Instead of maximizing crushing power or endurance over long terrestrial pursuits, your body invests heavily in explosive motion. Power concentrated into brief moments, because flight begins violently. Many modern people imagine large flying animals lifting gracefully into the air like swans or eagles pushing off with elegant wing beats. But Quetzalcoatlus may have operated more like a biological siege engine. Biomechanical studies suggest giant azhdarchids likely launched using all 4 limbs simultaneously, vaulting themselves upward through massive bursts of 4-limb-driven force. That idea sounds almost absurd at first, until you realize birds simply may not be the right comparison. Pterosaurs were not oversized birds. They were an entirely separate solution to flight, one that evolved long before modern birds dominated the sky. Their wings worked differently. Their launch systems worked differently. Even their walking posture followed separate evolutionary logic. And as your body grows, those differences become impossible to ignore. You spend more time climbing elevated ground now, instinctively drawn toward ridges overlooking the floodplains below. Wind matters increasingly. You feel it constantly against the wing membranes stretched along your sides. Tiny adjustments in air pressure already trigger subconscious reactions through muscles and joints still learning their purpose. Perhaps this is how flight truly begins. Not with courage, sensitivity, the ability to feel invisible structures moving through the atmosphere. Below the ridge, herds of hadrosaurs cross shallow water channels, while smaller predators shadow their movements from a distance. Farther south, smoke rises faintly from wildfire scars left after lightning storms swept through dry forest sections days earlier. The Late Cretaceous world is never still for long. Rivers migrate, storms reshape nesting grounds, entire food webs shift seasonally across the continent. For large flying animals, understanding movement may have mattered more than controlling territory. A grounded predator owns one region. A flyer studies patterns across hundreds of miles. You spread your wings wider against the wind. The membranes tremble slightly. Not feathers, not fur. A living surface threaded with blood vessels and muscle fibers, delicate enough to tear under bad conditions, yet strong enough to support one of the largest flying bodies Earth would ever produce. Some researchers believe pterosaur wings possessed remarkable control and flexibility, capable of subtle shape adjustments during flight. Others debate exactly how stable giant azhdarchids would have been in turbulent weather. The uncertainty matters because creatures this large operate dangerously close to physical limits. Flight becomes harder as size increases. Weight rises faster than wing area. Launching demands more force. Landing becomes riskier. At a certain point, evolution simply runs out of workable solutions. Yet somehow, your species crossed that threshold anyway. The question is, how far? One afternoon, heat rises intensely from the floodplain after heavy rainfall earlier in the day. Warm air rolls upward from sunlit mudbanks in shimmering, invisible columns. Above you, distant pterosaurs circle almost effortlessly without flapping. Rising air. You step closer to the ridge edge. Your heartbeat accelerates instinctively. Below lies a steep slope leading toward tangled vegetation and shallow water channels. Falling badly could snap fragile wing bones before true flight ever begins. Even minor injuries would become catastrophic out here. Giant flying animals cannot afford structural weakness. The wind shifts again. Your wings open wider automatically. Every instinct inside your body now points toward the same impossible idea. Jump. For several seconds, nothing happens. Then your hind limbs push. Not fully deliberate. Not fully accidental either. The world drops away instantly. Gravity seizes your body as the ridge disappears beneath you. Your wings snap outward violently while loose sediment explodes behind the launch point. Panic floods through every muscle. The air feels chaotic, unstable, alive. One wing catches more lift than the other, and your body twists sideways mid-descent. Then, the wind strikes beneath both membranes simultaneously. Everything changes. The fall slows. Not gracefully, not smoothly, but unmistakably. You are no longer simply dropping. For a few brief seconds, you glide. The sensation barely resembles movement on land. The floodplain unfolds beneath you in widening perspective, while warm air presses upward against your wings with surprising force. Every tiny adjustment affects direction immediately. Your body overcorrects repeatedly, wobbling through unstable currents while instinct fights to organize motions evolution has spent millions of years refining. Below, the ground rushes closer again. You slam awkwardly into soft mud near the edge of shallow water, tumbling forward with wings folding chaotically around your body. Pain shoots through one forelimb. You remain still. The wetlands return slowly around you. Insects buzz over stagnant water. Small fish scatter through muddy channels nearby. Distant thunder rolls again across the horizon. But something irreversible has happened. For a moment, gravity loosened its hold, and now the ground feels smaller. Over the following months, the attempts continue. Short glides become controlled descents. Controlled descents become brief powered launches assisted by rising air currents. Your muscles strengthen. Coordination sharpens. The giant fourth fingers anchoring your wings grow more stable under stress. Landing remains ugly and dangerous, but the sky slowly transforms from mystery into territory. Not safe territory, just accessible territory. That distinction matters, because the sky of the Late Cretaceous was not empty freedom. Storm systems could kill giant flyers quickly. Crosswinds could shred wing membranes. Failed landings could cripple even healthy adults. Large pterosaurs may have depended heavily on environmental conditions favoring efficient soaring rather than constant flapping flight. Some paleontologists even argue Quetzalcoatlus spent more time walking than flying, stalking prey across open ground like gigantic predatory storks. Others envision them as powerful, long-distance soarers, crossing enormous prehistoric landscapes with astonishing efficiency. Perhaps both interpretations contain part of the truth. The larger you become, the more flight turns into strategy rather than impulse. One evening, as the sun lowers red through humid storm haze, you climb the ridge again, overlooking the endless floodplain. Herds move far below, like drifting shadows between rivers reflecting orange light. Far overhead, adult Quetzalcoatlus circle silently through the upper air currents, barely moving their wings against the atmosphere. For the first time, you do not watch them with confusion. You watch them with recognition. And somewhere, beyond the distant horizon, beyond forests and wetlands and inland seas, an older adult of your species is already traveling across ancient North America toward feeding grounds you cannot yet imagine. Because surviving childhood was only the beginning. The real challenge is learning how to live inside a body large enough to fall out of the sky. By the time your wings can finally carry you with confidence across the floodplains of Late Cretaceous North America, something unexpected begins to happen. You stop wanting to stay in the air. At first, that instinct feels almost wrong. Flight had seemed like the final answer to survival when you were young. Escape the predators below, rise above the forests, leave danger trapped on the ground while you move freely across the sky. But the larger your body becomes, the more expensive flight starts to feel. Every launch demands explosive force through your forelimbs and chest. Every landing risks injury. Strong headwinds drain energy quickly. Storm turbulence becomes genuinely dangerous now that your wings stretch wider than many modern aircraft. And slowly, without fully realizing it, you begin spending more time walking. Not clumsily, not reluctantly, efficiently. The floodplains open before you in endless bands of mud, low vegetation, braided rivers, and drying wetlands shimmering beneath humid sunlight. Here, your body suddenly makes sense in a completely different way. Standing fully upright on all four limbs, you tower over most creatures around you. Your long neck gives you a broad visual field across the grasslands. Your elongated jaws can snap downward with astonishing speed. Even your stride feels specialized now, a deliberate, energy-efficient gait built for covering enormous distances without wasting motion. For decades, many people imagined giant pterosaurs as permanent aerial drifters, creatures that spent nearly all their lives gliding over oceans or soaring endlessly through prehistoric skies. But newer interpretations of Quetzalcoatlus suggest something stranger and, in many ways, more unsettling. You may have been one of the largest terrestrial predators in your ecosystem. Not a tyrannosaur, not an ambush hunter, something quieter. A giant walker moving patiently across open ground like a living shadow. The morning heat rises off the floodplain as insects scatter around your feet. Small vertebrates dart through low vegetation ahead. You pause near a shallow mudbank while distant hadrosaurs feed along the edge of a river channel half a mile away. The scale of the environment has changed now that you are older. Places that once felt impossibly huge during childhood have become manageable territories connected by instinct and memory. You know where water remains longest during dry periods. You know where smaller animals gather at dawn. You know which riverbanks collapse easily beneath heavy weight. And most importantly, you know how to conserve energy. That may have been one of the defining advantages of Quetzalcoatlus. Large flying animals cannot survive through constant exertion. Every movement must justify itself. Modern soaring birds exploit thermals and air currents whenever possible because powered flight is expensive even for smaller species. For an animal your size, efficiency becomes survival itself. So you walk, hour after hour, beneath a sky crowded with rising heat currents. The floodplain smells different now than it did when you first hatched. Your senses have sharpened with size and experience. Rotting carcasses can be detected from remarkable distances. Water carries scent trails through humid air. Storms announce themselves long before clouds appear overhead. Some researchers believe giant azhdarchids may have relied heavily on vision while hunting, stalking prey visually across open terrain, rather than fishing like pelicans or scavenging exclusively from carcasses. That distinction matters because it changes you from a passive glider into an active hunter. Movement flickers ahead. A small reptilian animal bursts from vegetation, sprinting desperately across cracked mud. Instantly, your body reacts. Long neck forward, wings partially spread for balance, four limbs accelerating with startling speed despite your enormous size. Then, the strike. Your jaws snap downward with violent precision. The prey disappears instantly between your beak-like mouth before the floodplain returns to silence. Quick, efficient, minimal wasted effort, and strangely familiar. The hunting style resembles certain modern ground birds more than giant reptiles. Some paleontologists compare azhdarchids to gigantic storks or marabou birds, opportunistic predators capable of swallowing surprisingly large prey whole. Others argue Quetzalcoatlus may have occupied a more specialized ecological role still poorly understood because the fossil record preserves anatomy more easily than behavior. But behavior leaves clues in structure. Your neck vertebrae are stiffened yet lightweight. Your skull is long but not massively reinforced for wrestling giant prey. Your limbs are built for movement across land as much as air. Everything about your body suggests an animal evolved around reaching quickly and traveling efficiently. You continue moving westward through open terrain while distant thunderheads build across the horizon. The climate here remains unstable. Some years bring heavy rainfall that transforms floodplains into enormous wetlands. Other periods dry the land into cracked mud and shrinking river systems. Entire ecosystems migrate seasonally depending on water availability. And migration attracts death. Ahead, vultures do not yet exist as humans would recognize them, but smaller scavenging pterosaurs circle low over something hidden beyond a ridge. You approach cautiously. A carcass, one of the hadrosaurs, already half consumed. The smell hits immediately. Thick decay mixing with wet heat rising from exposed flesh. Insects swarm in black clouds over the remains, while smaller predators dart nervously around the edges, searching for opportunities. Then everything scatters at once. You raise your head. Heavy footsteps. The vegetation parts slowly. Tyrannosaurus. Even from a distance, the size feels unnatural. The predator emerges through the reeds with horrifying calm, each step sinking deep into wet sediment, while scavengers retreat instantly from the carcass. Sunlight catches across scarred scales and muscle, heavy enough to shake loose insects from nearby branches. Its head alone appears nearly the size of your entire torso. You freeze, motionless. Not because you are weak, because survival often belongs to animals that understand scale correctly. There is an important difference between being large and being dominant. Quetzalcoatlus may have been among the tallest animals in the ecosystem, but height does not automatically translate into combat advantage. Your skeleton remains lightweight by necessity. Your wings are fragile compared to the crushing bite force of a tyrannosaur. Flight provides escape, not invulnerability. The giant carnivore lowers its skull toward the carcass. For now, you are beneath its interest. That realization may have shaped the psychology of giant pterosaurs more than any anatomical adaptation. You occupy a strange middle position within the ecosystem, too large for most predators to attack casually, too delicate to challenge apex carnivores directly. Your species survives through awareness, mobility, and timing rather than brute force. The tyrannosaur tears into the carcass with explosive movements, while blood-dark water spreads through the mud around its feet. Bone cracks echo across the floodplain. Nearby scavengers wait nervously at a distance, understanding the ancient rhythm of feeding hierarchy. You back away slowly. No sudden motion. No challenge. Then you turn toward the open plains again. As the afternoon heat intensifies, rising thermals shimmer visibly above the landscape. Several adult Quetzalcoatlus appear high overhead now, drifting through invisible air currents with almost eerie stillness. Watching them from the ground changes your understanding of flight completely. The sky is not home. It is a tool. That distinction may explain why Quetzalcoatlus evolved such powerful terrestrial adaptations despite retaining enormous wings. Flight allowed rapid travel between feeding grounds, nesting areas, and seasonal resources spread across vast prehistoric environments. But once you arrived, much of life still happened on land. And land was dangerous in ways the sky never fully solved. Near dusk, storms finally reach the floodplain. Rain slams against the wetlands in dense sheets, while wind tears through low vegetation. You move toward elevated terrain instinctively, because experience has already taught you how quickly water can become lethal. Seasonal floods reshape entire regions here, young animals drown, nests disappear, carcasses collect downstream in tangled debris fields. Lightning flashes across the darkening sky. For a moment, the entire floodplain illuminates white, and you see them. Several Quetzalcoatlus standing far across the plain near a shallow river basin. Not flying, walking. Tall enough that their silhouettes rise above the vegetation like strange skeletal towers moving through the rain. The sight feels almost prehistoric, even within prehistory itself, because there is nothing truly modern to compare them to. No living animal combines these proportions. Long necks, massive wings folded against quadrupedal bodies, heads balanced high above the ground with predatory stillness. They resemble creatures assembled from unrelated parts of evolution and somehow made functional anyway. The storm intensifies while you continue toward higher ground. One of the distant Quetzalcoatlus launches suddenly into the air. The movement happens faster than something so large should be capable of moving. Forelimbs drive downward explosively. Wings unfold. The body vaults upward in a burst of mud and rainwater before catching powerful wind currents almost immediately. Within seconds, it disappears into the dark clouds. That launch may have been among the most physically demanding actions performed by any flying animal in Earth's history. And one day, your body will be large enough that every takeoff carries similar consequences, because gravity becomes more dangerous as size increases. An injured small bird can sometimes recover. An injured giant flyer may never leave the ground again. Night settles slowly across the floodplain after the storm passes. Water drips from conifers, while distant dinosaur calls echo through darkness hidden beyond the wetlands. The air smells cleaner now, though decay still lingers beneath the rain. You stand alone near the ridge, overlooking miles of flooded terrain, reflecting pale moonlight. Somewhere below, predators continue hunting. Somewhere overhead, unseen pterosaurs still ride the night winds. And somewhere, deep inside your growing instincts, another realization begins forming quietly. The older you become, the less your life revolves around learning to fly. And the more it revolves around learning exactly when not to. The floodplains begin changing long before you fully understand why. At first, it feels subtle. More movement in the sky. More distant silhouettes crossing the river valleys at dusk. Strange calls echoing through the warm evening air where silence normally settles after sunset. The giant wetlands of late Cretaceous North America remain dangerous as always. Predators still stalk the forests. Storms still reshape the land. Carcasses still rot beneath clouds of insects. But another force has begun pulling creatures across enormous distances. The breeding season has arrived, and suddenly the world feels crowded with your own kind. You glide above a winding river basin as morning fog drifts low across the wetlands beneath you. Rising thermals lift your wings with minimal effort while the sunlight slowly burns through the haze below. From this height, the floodplain appears endless. Forests broken by shallow lakes, mudflats shimmering with trapped rainwater, herds moving like dark currents across open ground. Then you see them. Several Quetzalcoatlus already standing along a dry ridge near the edge of the basin. Even after years of growing into your own size, the sight remains unsettling. They do not look real. The tallest individuals stand high enough to peer over vegetation that hides most other predators completely. Folded wings hang against elongated bodies, while narrow skulls tilt slowly toward the sky, scanning movement across the plains with eerie stillness. Their proportions remain so strange that even nature itself seems uncertain about them. Too thin for their height, too large for flight to seem possible, too skeletal to feel alive, until one suddenly moves. And when they move, the illusion disappears instantly. You descend carefully toward the ridge, while warm air rolls upward from the sunlit earth below. Landing among giant Ashdarchids demands caution now. These are not social animals in the modern mammalian sense. No evidence suggests affectionate bonding or cooperative family structures like wolves or primates. But complete isolation may not fit the fossil clues either. Some pterosaur species appear to have nested colonially. Others may have gathered seasonally around favorable environments. For Quetzalcoatlus, the truth remains uncertain. Yet every year, individuals still arrive here. That alone suggests instinct stronger than coincidence. Your feet strike the ground in a controlled landing, while nearby adults barely react. One turns its head briefly toward you before resuming its still posture overlooking the floodplain. Another slowly spreads its wings halfway toward the morning sun, exposing dark membranes crossed by branching blood vessels glowing faintly beneath the light. The display feels deliberate, and perhaps it is. Modern birds use feathers for signaling constantly. Color, posture, wing position, sound. Pterosaurs lacked feathers across their wings, but that does not mean they lacked visual communication. Soft tissue structures rarely fossilize well, leaving enormous gaps in our understanding of prehistoric appearance. Some scientists suspect certain pterosaurs may have displayed vibrant skin coloration, inflatable throat sacs, or keratin crests used for species recognition and mating displays. If true, the breeding grounds of giant Ashdarchids may have looked far stranger than most modern reconstructions suggest. Not monsters, living signals. The air vibrates suddenly with a deep, resonant call from farther down the ridge. You turn immediately. An enormous Quetzalcoatlus male, perhaps older than any you have encountered before, strides slowly across the elevated ground with wings partially extended. The sound does not resemble a bird call. It feels lower, hollow, almost mammalian in its depth. His elongated skull tilts backward, while the throat expands slightly beneath the jawline before another vibration rolls across the wetlands. Nearby individuals react instantly. Heads rise. Wings shift. Postures change. No fighting begins, but tension spreads through the group with obvious force. That may have been one of the defining realities of giant flying animals during mating season. Direct combat carries catastrophic risk. A broken wing membrane, a damaged forelimb, a fractured hollow bone. Any serious injury could permanently end flight capability. For an animal dependent on mobility across vast prehistoric ecosystems, crippling damage likely meant slow death. So evolution may have favored intimidation over violence. Size, sound, display. The male continues walking along the ridge, while sunlight catches across the enormous crest running along the back of his skull. Whether Quetzalcoatlus possessed dramatic soft tissue ornamentation remains debated, but related pterosaur species displayed extravagant cranial structures, likely used for signaling. Some paleontologists suspect giant azhdarchids may have exhibited similar features, perhaps varying between sexes or changing with maturity. The possibility changes the atmosphere of the gathering completely. Because suddenly, this is not simply a congregation of predators. It is a performance. Wind moves through the floodplain, while more Quetzalcoatlus arrive overhead throughout the afternoon. Some descend gracefully on rising thermals, while others launch from distant ridges and glide low across the wetlands before landing near the group. The gathering grows larger with each passing hour, and still they remain strangely quiet most of the time. No chaotic flock behavior, no dense colonies like seabirds. Space matters here. Large flyers require room for launch and landing. They require visibility. They require stable terrain strong enough to support repeated takeoff attempts from bodies approaching the upper limits of powered flight. Perhaps that explains why the breeding grounds form here along elevated dry ridges instead of deeper wetlands below. Or perhaps these locations simply reduce predator risk for future nests. Again, certainty disappears. The fossil record preserves skeletons more easily than behavior, and mating rituals vanish almost entirely unless extraordinary conditions freeze brief moments into stone. Scientists can infer patterns from anatomy, spacing, and modern ecological parallels, but much of the emotional texture of prehistoric life remains hidden. Still, some truths reveal themselves indirectly. You notice how individuals orient themselves into the wind before displaying. How dominant adults occupy the most stable sections of elevated ground. How smaller or younger individuals avoid crossing too close to certain territories along the ridge. These patterns emerge for reasons. As sunset approaches, the displays intensify. Several males begin pacing across open terrain with wings partially raised, making themselves appear even larger against the orange light spilling across the floodplain. One lowers its head dramatically while producing another deep, resonant call that echoes through the humid air. Another launches briefly into the sky before circling back low over the ridge, forcing smaller individuals to step aside beneath the pressure of descending wings. Flight itself becomes part of the display, and that may have carried enormous evolutionary weight. For creatures this large, successful flight signals health immediately. A damaged flyer cannot hide weakness for long. Poor launches, unstable landings, torn wing membranes, exhaustion during display flights. all become visible indicators of reduced survival potential. In a world this dangerous, reproduction may have depended less on beauty than on mechanical competence. You move farther along the ridge, while darkness slowly spreads across the wetlands below. Nearby, two enormous Quetzalcoatlus face one another across open ground, with wings fully extended now. The membranes catch fading light like stretched shadows, while both animals produce low, vibrating calls through expanding throats. Neither attacks, neither retreats. Then, one finally lowers its wings and walks away. The encounter ends without blood. That restraint may seem surprisingly calm for prehistoric giants, but large animals often survive by avoiding unnecessary escalation. Modern giraffes, elephants, and large birds all rely heavily on posture and ritualized behavior before true combat occurs. For Quetzalcoatlus, the consequences of physical injury may have made restraint even more important. Night settles heavily over the breeding grounds. Moonlight reflects faintly across shallow water channels below, while insects swarm in dense clouds above the reeds. Some Quetzalcoatlus remain standing, nearly motionless against the stars. Others sleep in lowered resting postures along the ridge. A few launch silently into the darkness, vanishing over the floodplain toward distant feeding areas before dawn returns. You remain awake longer than usual, watching, listening. The breeding season reveals something unsettling about your species. For all your size, your survival still depends on fragile timing. Finding mates before storms destroy nesting grounds. Producing offspring before predators discover the nests. Remaining healthy enough to survive migration, drought, injury, or sudden environmental collapse. The larger an animal becomes, the narrower its margin for failure. And Quetzalcoatlus may have existed dangerously close to those limits already. Days later, after the gatherings begin stabilizing into loose territorial patterns, you follow one female farther south along the elevated ridges overlooking the floodplain. She moves with practiced efficiency across broken terrain, occasionally pausing to inspect soil conditions near dry patches above the wetlands. Nest selection. The behavior immediately changes the atmosphere around you. Everything suddenly feels more serious. Because reproduction for giant pterosaurs was never simply about mating. It was about gambling the future of the species against the instability of an entire continent. The ground must remain dry enough to protect soft-shelled eggs, close enough to water for survival, open enough for launching into flight, hidden enough to reduce predator attention. No perfect place exists, only less dangerous ones. The female stops, finally, beside a broad stretch of elevated sediment overlooking a winding river channel below. Wind moves steadily across the ridge, while distant storms flash silently beyond the western horizon. You study the location carefully, and for the first time since hatching, a strange realization settles over you with quiet weight. Somewhere very close to a place like this, your own life began too. But the floodplains are changing now. The seasons feel less predictable, the storms stronger. And far beyond the horizon, beyond every migrating herd and breeding ridge and prehistoric river system beneath the late Cretaceous sky, the world is already moving slowly towards something none of you can possibly understand yet. The eggs do not look important enough to carry the future of giants. They rest half buried beneath damp sediment along the elevated ridge, exposed to heat, rain, insects, and every hungry creature moving through the floodplains below. Soft-shelled, fragile, silent. If a passing predator discovered them now, the entire nesting season could vanish in minutes without leaving anything behind except scattered membranes dissolving into mud. And yet, inside those thin shells, bodies are already forming that may someday cross the skies of prehistoric North America with wings wider than modern airplanes. That contradiction never disappears. The larger Quetzalcoatlus becomes as a species, the more vulnerable its beginning seems. Wind moves steadily across the ridge, while dark storm clouds gather above distant wetlands. The breeding grounds have grown quieter in recent days. Most territorial displays are over now. The calls that once echoed across the floodplains each evening have faded into occasional low vibrations drifting through the humid air after sunset. Energy is no longer being spent on intimidation or mating flights. Now it is being spent on survival. You stand near the nesting ground, scanning the open plains below, while insects gather around shallow puddles left from last night's rain. Far across the floodplain, herds of hadrosaurs move slowly between shrinking water channels, while smaller predators follow at a careful distance. Life continues everywhere at once. Hunting, feeding, migrating, dying. The world does not pause simply because new life is beginning. And that may have shaped the entire reproductive strategy of giant pterosaurs. Unlike mammals, you cannot carry offspring internally while moving safely through dangerous environments. Unlike many modern birds, producing large numbers of heavily protected eggs would likely become too expensive for an animal already operating near the physical limits of flight. Every biological investment must remain balanced against weight, energy, mobility, and environmental instability, which means your species may have relied on a harsher strategy. Not guaranteed survival. Probability. Produce offspring quickly enough, often enough, and across enough territory that some eventually survive. The rain begins again shortly before dusk. Warm drops strike the ridge, while the wetlands below dissolve into rippling gray water beneath growing wind. You shift position carefully around the nest site, avoiding pressure near the buried eggs. Whether Quetzalcoatlus guarded nests continuously remains uncertain. Some paleontologists suspect adults stayed nearby for at least portions of development. Others argue hatchlings may have emerged highly precocial, relatively mobile and independent soon after birth, reducing the need for prolonged parental care. But even if independence came early, the eggs themselves still required stability. And stability barely exists here. Lightning flashes across the horizon. A sudden gust tears through the ridge, hard enough to force your wings partially open for balance. Water begins flowing downhill through narrow channels forming rapidly in the soft sediment. Already, the landscape is changing shape beneath the storm. Small sections of earth collapse near the slope edges, while loose vegetation slides toward the flooded lowlands below. One bad season could erase an entire generation. Perhaps that is why Quetzalcoatlus spread across such enormous territories. Giant animals dependent on unstable nesting grounds cannot afford ecological isolation. Survival may have depended on constant movement between regions, searching for temporary windows where climate, terrain, and food availability aligned just long enough to raise offspring successfully. The storm intensifies overnight. You remain near the ridge through darkness, while thunder rolls continuously across the floodplains. Somewhere nearby, another Quetzalcoatlus launches briefly into the air during the storm, likely forced to relocate from worsening ground conditions farther downslope. The sound of giant wings striking heavy rainwater echoes strangely through the darkness before disappearing. Then the river below begins rising, fast. By dawn, entire sections of the lower floodplain have vanished beneath muddy water. Dead branches, uprooted vegetation, and bloated carcasses drift through widening channels, while smaller animals scramble desperately toward higher ground. The prehistoric world often feels ancient and stable from a distance, but living inside it reveals something very different. Everything is temporary. Rivers migrate, forests burn, wetlands dry, storms rewrite landscapes overnight, and every species survives only by adapting faster than the environment collapses beneath it. The eggs survive the flooding this time. Barely. Water reaches the lower edges of the nesting ground before receding slowly through the afternoon heat. One nest farther down the ridge is not as fortunate. Sediment has collapsed completely there, exposing fragments of torn shell beneath wet mud, while scavenging insects swarm over the remains. No dramatic tragedy, no heroic struggle, just absence. That may be the most realistic part of prehistoric survival. Extinction often begins quietly at the smallest scales, long before species disappear completely. Failed nests, reduced hatch rates, unstable climate patterns, tiny statistical losses repeated across generations. You study the destroyed nest briefly before moving away. There is nothing left to protect. Days pass beneath growing heat after the storms. The floodplain steams under dense sunlight, while insects hatch in enormous clouds from standing water left behind across the wetlands. Small prey becomes more abundant now. Tiny vertebrates move constantly through fresh vegetation along the riverbanks, feeding aggressively during the humid recovery period after flooding. You hunt often, not for yourself alone anymore. The change in behavior feels instinctive and mechanical at the same time. Long-distance flights become shorter now, focused around reliable feeding grounds within range of the nesting ridge. Risk calculations shift constantly. Every launch consumes energy needed later. Every injury threatens more than individual survival now. And perhaps this is where giant flying animals become most trapped by their own success. The larger the body, the harder reproduction becomes. Modern small birds can raise multiple broods rapidly because flight remains relatively inexpensive at lower masses. But for something like Quetzalcoatlus, every stage carries massive biological costs. Large eggs, slow maturation, enormous food requirements, dangerous takeoffs and landings, delicate wing membranes vulnerable to damage. One severe injury during nesting season could doom both parent and offspring. Yet evolution kept pushing your lineage larger anyway. Why? Perhaps size reduced predation pressure enough to offset reproductive difficulty. Perhaps long-distance soaring opened access to scattered resources unavailable to smaller competitors. Or perhaps gigantism emerged gradually through sexual selection, where larger individuals gained mating advantages until the entire species approached the upper boundaries of workable flight. Whatever the reason, the result now stands beside a fragile nesting ridge, watching storms reshape the continent. One morning, movement beneath the sediment finally begins. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. The eggs shift slightly as weak internal movements disturb the damp soil covering them. Tiny tears appear along one membrane, while nearby insects gather immediately around the scent of exposed organic material. Everything here responds to vulnerability with terrifying speed. You lower your head toward the nest. The hatchling inside struggles awkwardly against the shell, limbs pressing blindly through the soft membrane, while wet wings remain folded tightly around its body. The proportions already look familiar. Oversized skull, long forelimbs, thin neck trembling against gravity. A smaller version of the same impossible design. And suddenly, the floodplain feels far more dangerous than it did before. The hatchling drags itself free into open air while the humid wind moves across its wet body. Nearby predators may already detect the scent of exposed eggs and newborn tissue drifting across the ridge. Some modern reptiles and birds lose enormous percentages of offspring within the first days after hatching. There is little reason to think the Late Cretaceous was gentler. If anything, it was probably worse. The newborn struggles upright briefly before collapsing again against the warm sediment. So much of giant prehistoric life depends on surviving these early moments. Not strength, not dominance, just endurance through vulnerability. The hatchling remains close to the nesting ground over the following days, while its movements gradually become steadier. Whether young Quetzalcoatlus relied heavily on parental feeding remains debated. Some researchers suspect hatchlings may have hunted small prey independently, surprisingly early. Others suggest at least limited provisioning from adults during initial development. The uncertainty feels strangely appropriate, because even now, standing beside the hatchling as evening storms gather again beyond the wetlands, the line between protection and abandonment remains blurry. You cannot shield it from everything. No parent here can. Not from floods, not from drought, not from giant predators crossing the floodplain at night, not from starvation if feeding grounds collapse, and certainly not from the larger forces already beginning to destabilize ecosystems across the late Cretaceous world. The seasons are changing strangely. Water patterns feel less predictable now than during your youth. Certain feeding areas no longer support the same concentrations of prey. Some migration routes appear shifted. Forest fires burn hotter during dry periods, before violent storms return again with overwhelming floods. The continent itself feels restless. Perhaps no individual animal notices climate change clearly across a single lifetime, but ecosystems notice, rivers notice, nesting grounds notice. Subtle environmental instability accumulates quietly through generations, long before extinction becomes visible. At sunset, you stand beside the ridge while the hatchling sleeps, partially buried beneath warm sediment nearby. Far overhead, several Quetzalcoatlus drift silently through rising evening thermals, crossing toward distant floodplains glowing orange beneath the fading light. The sight feels ancient beyond comprehension, a species large enough to darken sections of sky, yet still forced to gamble its future inside soft eggs hidden in unstable mud. And somewhere beyond the western horizon tonight, unseen volcanic eruptions continue reshaping Earth's atmosphere, while an asteroid the size of a mountain keeps moving silently through deep space toward a planet filled with creatures too busy surviving tomorrow to imagine the end of everything. The sky feels different now. Not empty, not hostile, something stranger than that. Unstable. You notice it first in the wind patterns above the floodplains. Thermals that once rose predictably from the wetlands now collapse suddenly by midday. Storm fronts form faster than they used to. Entire stretches of air above the river valleys churn with violent turbulence, strong enough to force even experienced flyers downward before sunset. Some days, the atmosphere hangs unnaturally still for hours beneath a pale white haze. Other days, heat erupts upward from the earth in twisting columns powerful enough to carry giant bodies thousands of feet above the plains with barely a wing beat. The late Cretaceous world is changing, and creatures built around mastering the sky are among the first to feel it. You glide low above a shrinking river basin while morning fog drifts between dying forests below. Several years have passed since the nesting seasons that once crowded these ridges with display calls and territorial movement. The hatchling that survived the floods now flies independently somewhere beyond the southern wetlands, if it survived at all. There is no way to know. Your species does not reunite through memory the way humans imagine families. Life scatters quickly once flight arrives. And increasingly, survival seems to favor movement over attachment. Below, the floodplain no longer looks as abundant as it once did. Sections of forest stand dead near the waterline, their trunks pale and stripped beneath heavy heat. Smaller prey animals have become harder to predict. Entire feeding grounds that once supported dense populations now remain strangely quiet for weeks at a time before briefly exploding with life again after storms. The rhythm of the continent is becoming irregular. Perhaps no individual creature understands environmental collapse while living inside it. There is no moment where the sky announces that an age is ending. No warning spreads through the wetlands, telling species they are approaching the edge of existence. Instead, ecosystems fray slowly. Food webs thin. Seasons lose consistency. And the animals most dependent on stability begin struggling first. For giant pterosaurs like Quetzalcoatlus, that instability may have carried enormous consequences. Large flying animals require vast feeding territories and reliable environmental patterns. They cannot survive easily inside collapsing ecosystems because their size limits flexibility. Smaller birds can adapt quickly to changing prey. Small mammals can hide, burrow, reproduce rapidly, or survive on limited food sources. But giant flyers depend on scale, distance, predictability, and the sky above North America is becoming harder to trust. You descend toward open terrain near the edge of a drying lake bed, while warm wind presses unevenly against your wings. The landing comes harder than expected as shifting crosswinds force sudden adjustments seconds before touchdown. Your forelimbs absorb the impact awkwardly, while loose sediment bursts beneath your feet. Even minor landings feel more dangerous now. Perhaps age contributes to that realization. Or perhaps the atmosphere itself has truly changed. Some paleoclimatic evidence suggests the final million years of the Cretaceous may have included significant environmental stress tied partly to massive volcanic eruptions in what is now India. Eruptions so enormous they continued for hundreds of thousands of years. The exact effects remain debated, but volcanic gases may have altered climate systems globally long before the asteroid impact humans usually associate with dinosaur extinction. If so, the end of the age of dinosaurs may not have begun with one sudden catastrophe. It may have begun with worsening instability spread across generations. The dry lake bed crackles beneath your feet as insects scatter through the brittle ground cover. Nearby, smaller pterosaurs feed along the exposed mudflats, their bodies quick and agile compared to your towering frame. Years ago, skies like these may have contained far greater diversity of flying reptiles, but now, most surviving pterosaur species appear large, very large. That pattern has puzzled paleontologists for decades. Why did the smaller pterosaurs disappear while giant azhdarchids remained? One possibility hangs directly above you now. Birds. A flock of primitive birds bursts suddenly from nearby reeds, twisting sharply through the air with astonishing precision before vanishing into distant vegetation. They are tiny compared to you, fast, nervous, flexible. Their wings beat rapidly through turbulent wind conditions that would barely support your enormous body. Perhaps the skies were already changing ownership. Some scientists suspect birds gradually outcompeted smaller pterosaur species in certain ecological roles near the end of the Cretaceous. Birds reproduced faster, matured quickly, maneuvered efficiently through forests and unstable environments. Meanwhile, giant pterosaurs may have survived by occupying specialized niches too large for birds to exploit effectively. At least for a while. You continue across the dry basin while the heat intensifies overhead. In the distance, another Quetzalcoatlus launches from a ridge with explosive force before climbing slowly into the pale afternoon sky. Watching large adults take flight now carries a different emotional weight than it once did. The launches look harder, longer acceleration, heavier wing beats before stable soaring begins. Perhaps you imagine it. Or perhaps giant flyers are already operating near environmental limits, no longer as forgiving as they once were. Farther west, smoke stains the horizon dark gray. Wildfire again. The dry seasons have grown harsher in recent years. Entire stretches of forest burn beneath lightning storms before floods arrive weeks later to drown the surviving vegetation under thick sediment. Ecosystems recover, but not always the same way. Certain feeding grounds return weaker each cycle, and migration patterns begin shifting with them. You spend more time traveling now. Long-distance soaring across ancient North America reveals changes impossible to detect from a single territory alone. Rivers that once spread across broad wetlands have narrowed into isolated channels in some regions. Other floodplains remain permanently submerged after repeated storms. Coastal winds behave differently near the great inland seaway dividing the continent. Nothing catastrophic in isolation, but together, the continent feels restless. One evening, high above the western plains, you encounter another adult Quetzalcoatlus gliding along the same thermal corridor. For several minutes, both of you circle silently through rising air currents without aggression or display. At this altitude, movement becomes strangely peaceful. The floodplains below flatten into abstract color and shadow, while warm air lifts enormous bodies effortlessly toward fading sunlight. Then the other flyer suddenly folds slightly sideways against a violent burst of turbulence. The recovery comes fast, but not perfect. One wingtip dips sharply before stabilizing again, and for a brief instant, you glimpse something terrifying. Fragility, not weakness. Fragility. The sky remains survivable only as long as conditions stay within narrow physical boundaries. Creatures your size cannot improvise easily against sudden atmospheric violence. A failed landing, a torn membrane, an exhausted launch during bad weather. Tiny mechanical failures can become fatal rapidly when your body depends entirely on balancing enormous wings against gravity. The older you become, the clearer this truth feels. Quetzalcoatlus did not conquer the sky. It negotiated with it. Night falls slowly over the plains, while distant thunderheads pulse faintly beneath the horizon. You settle along an elevated ridge, overlooking miles of dark wetlands, reflecting moonlight through broken channels below. Far away, something large moves through the forests near the riverbanks. Hadrosaurs, perhaps, or predators following them. The continent still teems with life, but the abundance feels thinner now. Even the sounds are changing. Years ago, the floodplains after sunset vibrated constantly with overlapping calls, movement, insects, and migration. Now, long stretches of silence appear between those sounds. Entire valleys feel empty for days before sudden bursts of activity return again, as though ecosystems are breathing unevenly. Above you, the stars emerge one by one through gaps in the clouds. Somewhere among them moves an object no creature on Earth yet understands. Not bright enough to notice, not close enough to fear, still months away from impact, and yet already connected invisibly to everything happening below. Because extinction rarely begins at the moment of destruction itself. By the time final catastrophe arrives, many systems are often already strained, fragmented, vulnerable. Large specialized animals suffer first, because specialization works beautifully inside stable worlds and disastrously inside collapsing ones. You lower your body against the ridge, while warm wind moves softly through the grass around you. Sleep comes lightly now. Storms wake you often. The atmosphere feels unpredictable even at night. Then, sometime before dawn, another sound echoes across the dark floodplain. A launch. You raise your head immediately. Far across the wetlands, a massive Quetzalcoatlus struggles briefly against strong crosswinds while attempting takeoff from soft ground near the river edge. The wings beat heavily. Mud sprays beneath powerful forelimbs. For several seconds, the body remains trapped between running and flight, before finally climbing upward into unstable air. The ascent looks exhausting. The flyer disappears eventually into darkness above the storm clouds. But the image remains with you, because somewhere deep inside, instincts refined over millions of years, another realization has begun forming quietly. The world that created giant flying reptiles may no longer fully support them anymore. And the sky above the Late Cretaceous, once wide enough for creatures larger than imagination, is slowly becoming a harder place to survive. The morning begins strangely quiet. No storms move across the floodplains. No heavy winds shake the forests. Even the insects seem thinner in the humid air, their constant buzzing softened beneath a pale sky washed almost white by heat. You stand along an elevated ridge overlooking the wetlands, while sunlight spreads slowly across the river valleys below, turning the shallow water channels gold beneath the early dawn. For a moment, the world feels suspended, not peaceful, waiting. Far in the distance, herds of hadrosaurs move through morning fog near the edge of a shrinking lake basin. Smaller predators weave between patches of dense vegetation, following migration routes worn into the floodplain over generations. Above them all, the sky stretches enormous and empty. Then something appears in it. At first, it looks almost harmless. A distant brightness high above the southern horizon. Not lightning, not fire, something sharper. You raise your head instinctively. The light grows rapidly. Within seconds, the object becomes impossible to ignore. A white streak cuts across the atmosphere brighter than the sun itself, dragging a tail of burning vapor behind it as it tears through the upper sky with catastrophic speed. The wetlands below erupt into chaos immediately. Herds begin running without direction. Smaller animals vanish into vegetation. Birds and pterosaurs launch violently upward from the floodplain in panicked waves. But the object is already too fast, too large, too late. The asteroid enters Earth's atmosphere, traveling faster than anything alive has ever experienced. Modern estimates suggest the Chicxulub impactor may have measured around 6 to 9 miles wide, carrying more energy than billions of nuclear weapons combined. The details remain studied and debated even now, but one reality stands beyond dispute. The collision will alter life on Earth permanently. Yet from your perspective, none of that exists. You do not understand asteroids. You do not understand extinction. You only understand that the sky has become terrifying. The light intensifies until shadows vanish entirely across the floodplain. The atmosphere itself seems to glow. Even distant clouds burn white along their edges, while the object disappears beyond the western horizon, somewhere impossibly far away. Then the world pauses. A strange silence spreads across the wetlands. No movement, no sound, and for several long moments, nothing happens at all. That delay may have been one of the most horrifying parts of the Chicxulub impact. Creatures thousands of miles away from the actual collision site would not see the asteroid strike directly. They would witness the aftermath arriving afterward through heat, atmospheric shock waves, earthquakes, firestorms, and environmental collapse spreading outward across the planet. The first sign reaches you through the ground, a low vibration. Then another. The ridge trembles beneath your feet, while shallow water ripples violently across the floodplain below. Trees sway unnaturally. Distant riverbanks collapse into muddy channels as seismic waves roll through the continent with impossible force. The earth itself feels unstable now. Then comes the sound. Not thunder, not volcanic eruption. Something deeper. A roar so immense it barely resembles noise anymore, more like pressure tearing through the atmosphere itself. The shock wave reaches the floodplain seconds later with explosive violence. Wind slams across the ridge hard enough to throw loose sediment into the air, while entire sections of forest bend beneath the blast. You spread your wings instinctively for balance, but balance no longer matters. The sky has become a weapon. Far across the horizon, a wall of smoke and fire begins rising into the upper atmosphere. Even at this distance, the scale looks unreal. Dark clouds boil upward beyond the curvature of the Earth itself, while the sunlight flickers strangely through suspended debris already spreading across the sky. Animals run everywhere now. The floodplain dissolves into pure survival panic. Hadrosaurs crash through wetlands without formation. Smaller predators abandon hunts entirely. Crocodilian bodies slide desperately into deeper water channels. Pterosaurs launch in every direction, searching for stable air that no longer exists. You leap from the ridge as violent winds rip through the floodplain. For several seconds, flight barely works. The atmosphere churns unpredictably beneath your wings, while rising heat currents collide with descending pressure waves from the distant impact. Ash and dust spread rapidly through the air. Visibility collapses. Even the sunlight begins changing color, turning orange beneath expanding clouds high above the continent. The Chicxulub impact likely triggered environmental effects across enormous portions of Earth. Some researchers suggest superheated debris re-entering the atmosphere may have ignited widespread fires globally. Others debate how uniformly those firestorms spread. But there is little doubt the atmosphere itself transformed rapidly after the collision, and giant flyers trapped inside unstable skies may have suffered almost immediately. You struggle westward against chaotic winds, while forests below begin burning. At first, the fires appear isolated, scattered patches ignited along dry vegetation near exposed ridges. Then, entire sections of woodland erupt simultaneously beneath raining debris falling from the upper atmosphere. Smoke spreads across the floodplains in rolling black walls, while terrified animals crowd river systems, searching instinctively for escape. But there is nowhere to go. The disaster is continental, possibly global. You descend hard near the edge of a flooded basin as turbulence threatens to tear control away entirely. The landing comes brutally. Mud explodes beneath your limbs, while heat pulses strangely through the air despite the growing darkness overhead. Darkness. That may have been the most unnatural part. By late afternoon, the sky already begins dimming beneath expanding layers of ash and dust spreading across the atmosphere. Sunlight weakens rapidly. The warm, late Cretaceous world that shaped your species for millions of years suddenly feels colder, quieter. Wrong. Around the basin, animals crowd together without normal territorial behavior. Herbivores stand near predators. Smaller scavengers hide beneath giant bodies. Instinct itself seems confused by the scale of the catastrophe unfolding around them. And perhaps confusion is the most realistic response. Extinction events do not announce themselves clearly while they happen. No species understands it is witnessing the end of an era. Survival instincts continue operating normally long after survival itself becomes mathematically impossible. Night arrives early beneath the expanding ash clouds. The fires continue burning beyond the floodplains, while strange glowing particles drift through the darkened air. Some settle across the water surface. Others collect along the muddy edges of the basin like black snow. You remain motionless beside the water. The atmosphere smells burned now, metallic, dry. Even the insects are disappearing. Hours pass beneath deepening darkness, while distant impacts continue echoing across the continent. Forests burn beyond the horizon in every direction. Occasionally, another Quetzalcoatlus appears briefly overhead through the smoke before vanishing again into the ash-filled sky. No calls, no displays, only movement. Because the sky that once connected giant pterosaurs across prehistoric North America has become almost impossible to navigate safely. And worse still, the true catastrophe has barely begun. The asteroid impact itself may have killed millions of animals immediately through shockwaves, fires, tsunamis, and falling debris. But the larger extinction likely unfolded afterward through ecological collapse. Dust and aerosols injected into the atmosphere may have blocked sunlight for months or years, disrupting photosynthesis across global ecosystems. The food chain is about to break. Large specialized animals will feel it first. By dawn, temperatures have already dropped noticeably. Ash covers the wetlands in gray layers, while the rising sun struggles to penetrate the atmosphere as more than a dim reddish glow. Dead fish float along shallow water channels. Burned vegetation hangs blackened along the floodplain edges. Even the river sounds seem muted beneath the thickening silence. The world that created Quetzalcoatlus is disappearing in real time. And for the first time in your life, flight no longer feels like freedom. It feels like exposure. High above the continent, the atmosphere remains poisoned with drifting ash and unstable currents. Feeding grounds are burning. Migration routes are collapsing. Nesting ridges are buried beneath debris and floodwater. Every advantage your species evolved around is suddenly becoming a weakness. Large body, high energy demands, slow reproduction, dependence on enormous territories, dependence on stable skies. You lower your head beside the darkened basin while ash continues falling softly across the dead wetlands around you. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the impact crater itself still burns. And though no living creature understands it yet, the age of giant flying reptiles has already entered its final chapter. The sky never fully recovers. Weeks after the impact, sunlight still struggles to reach the floodplains through layers of drifting ash and soot suspended high above the earth. The warmth that once rose naturally from the wetlands each morning has faded into a weak gray glow that barely heats the ground by midday. Entire forests stand blackened and silent along the river valleys. Lakes shrink beneath poisoned runoff. Even the wind feels thinner now, colder somehow, as though the atmosphere itself has grown exhausted. And for creatures built around air currents and distance, exhaustion spreads quickly. You move across the dead floodplains slowly, stepping around carcasses left untouched beside shallow water channels. Months ago, scavengers would have stripped them clean within hours. Insects would have swarmed every exposed surface. Predators would have competed violently for flesh before the sun finished rising. Now, many bodies simply remain where they fell. There are not enough survivors left to consume them all. That silence may have been one of the clearest signs the extinction was accelerating. Ecosystems are noisy when energy flows properly. Feeding, hunting, mating, migration. Movement creates sound constantly. But once food webs collapse, silence spreads outward through the environment like a second disaster following the first. And the floodplains of North America are becoming quieter every day. You stop beside the remains of a hadrosaur partially buried beneath gray sediment. The carcass is old now, stiffened by cold nights and drying winds. Smaller scavengers have fed here recently. Narrow bite marks along exposed tissue reveal that much. But the giant predators are mostly gone, or dying elsewhere. Tyrannosaurs required enormous amounts of food to survive. Large herbivores required massive plant systems. Once sunlight collapsed beneath atmospheric debris, the foundations supporting the entire Late Cretaceous ecosystem began unraveling from the bottom upward. Plants weakened first, then herbivores, then everything above them, and giant flyers like Quetzalcoatlus occupied a dangerous position within that chain. Your species survives partly through mobility, but mobility becomes meaningless once there is nowhere left worth reaching. You lift your head toward the darkened sky. For several days now, you have not seen another adult Quetzalcoatlus. That absence feels wrong. Before the impact, even distant skies often carried silhouettes drifting across thermal currents high above the floodplains. Sometimes, only tiny moving shapes against the clouds. Sometimes, enormous bodies gliding silently between feeding grounds hundreds of miles apart. But now, the skies remain mostly empty. Perhaps others still survive farther south. Perhaps they have migrated toward coastlines or warmer territories less damaged by the impact winter spreading across the continent. Or perhaps giant flying animals are simply disappearing too quickly for scattered survivors to encounter one another anymore. The uncertainty hangs over everything. Some scientists suspect the extinction of pterosaurs happened extremely rapidly after the Chicxulub impact. Others leave open the possibility that isolated populations may have survived briefly in fragmented refuges before ecological collapse finally reached them too. The fossil record near the extinction boundary remains incomplete enough that small windows of uncertainty still exist. But standing here now, beside dying wetlands beneath an ash-covered sky, survival already feels temporary. You spread your wings cautiously against the cold morning air. Even that movement hurts more than it once did. Age contributes to the stiffness. So does malnutrition. Flight muscles weaken quickly when feeding becomes inconsistent, and the post-impact world no longer supports reliable hunting patterns. Small prey animals still exist, but populations fluctuate wildly between regions. Some valleys appear lifeless for weeks before sudden pockets of activity emerge around surviving water sources. Everything has become unpredictable, and unpredictability is lethal for giant specialists. Still, instinct pushes you upward. You launch from the floodplain with a burst of mud and ash beneath your forelimbs, while cold wind catches awkwardly against your wings. The takeoff feels heavy immediately, slower than before the impact, less stable. The air itself no longer behaves the same way. Thermals have weakened. Without strong sunlight heating the ground consistently, the great rising columns of warm air that once carried enormous bodies effortlessly across continents now form irregularly, or not at all. Some days, the atmosphere remains almost dead from dawn until sunset. For Quetzalcoatlus, that may have been catastrophic. Your species evolved inside a world rich with solar heat, stable air patterns, and broad seasonal predictability. Large soaring animals exploit atmospheric structure itself as part of survival. Remove those invisible highways, and giant flight becomes vastly more expensive overnight. You struggle higher above the floodplain anyway. Below, the continent looks wounded. Burn scars stretch across ancient forests in enormous black swaths. River systems have changed course beneath landslides and flooding triggered after the impact. Entire herds lie dead beside shrinking lakes where poisoned vegetation once supported migrations numbering in the thousands. The scale of loss feels impossible, even from the air, and yet life continues stubbornly in smaller forms. You notice movement along a narrow creek below. Small mammals searching through debris fields near the waterline. Tiny birds dart through dead branches, hunting insects. Reptiles bask weakly beside exposed stones whenever sunlight briefly penetrates the clouds. The survivors are becoming smaller, faster, more flexible. Perhaps that was always the hidden weakness of giants. They dominate stable worlds beautifully, but unstable worlds favor adaptability instead. A small omnivore can survive on scraps, hide underground, reproduce quickly, and recover from population collapse within generations. A giant flyer cannot. You drift farther west following the remains of an ancient river valley, now choked with fallen trees and stagnant pools. The silence overhead continues. Then suddenly, movement. Far ahead through the haze, another Quetzalcoatlus glides low above the valley. Your body reacts instantly. Not aggression. Recognition. The other flyer looks thinner than normal, its wings beating occasionally instead of soaring continuously. One membrane appears damaged near the trailing edge, forcing constant adjustments against the unstable air. Even from a distance, exhaustion shows in the uneven movements. Still alive, barely. You circle closer through weak thermals, while the other adult descends toward a mudflat beside the river. The landing comes rough. Ash bursts beneath its limbs, while one wing drags awkwardly before folding against the body. The sight is deeply unsettling, not because the flyer is injured, because it looks old. For most of your life, Quetzalcoatlus embodied control, precision, scale balanced perfectly against movement. Even standing still, healthy adults carried an unsettling mechanical confidence, as though evolution had spent millions of years refining every proportion exactly toward this impossible form. But now, the species itself appears tired. The other adult lowers its head toward shallow water, while cold wind moves through torn wing membranes. No territorial displays follow your arrival. No warning postures. No calls echo across the valley. Only silence. That may have been another sign the extinction had progressed beyond recovery. Breeding behaviors disappear quickly once survival consumes all available energy. Courtship requires optimism at a biological level, investment in futures expected to continue. The post-impact world no longer offers that certainty. For several hours, both of you remain near the river basin, feeding occasionally on whatever small prey still moves through the mud flats. The atmosphere stays dim beneath drifting ash layers overhead, while temperatures continue dropping toward evening. Then, without warning, snow begins falling. Not heavy snow, thin, uneven, but enough to freeze sections of shallow water along the basin edge overnight. The sight feels impossible. Your species evolved through warm greenhouse climates spanning millions of years. Frost itself would have been rare across much of your range before the extinction event. Yet now, ice forms along dead vegetation, while ash continues drifting from darkened skies above. The world is becoming alien faster than evolution can respond. Morning arrives beneath heavy clouds. The other Quetzalcoatlus attempts flight first. You watch carefully as it spreads damaged wings against the freezing wind. The launch takes longer than it should. Forelimbs strain violently against the mud, while weak thermals fail to provide proper lift. For several terrifying seconds, the body barely leaves the ground. Then, finally, it rises. Low, unsteady, the flyer disappears slowly into gray fog above the valley. You never see it again. Perhaps it survived weeks longer somewhere beyond the horizon. Perhaps it crashed during the next storm. Perhaps there are only dozens of your species remaining now, across an entire continent once large enough to support skies filled with giant pterosaurs. No creature alive can know, but the loneliness spreading through the air feels real. You remain beside the frozen basin another day before instinct pushes you skyward again. Hunger demands movement. The body still remembers ancient migratory urges shaped across thousands of generations of seasonal travel. So you fly across dead rivers, across burned forests, across empty breeding ridges where no display calls echo anymore. And as the cold winds of the post-impact world move silently beneath your wings, another realization settles slowly into your aging mind. You are no longer flying toward life, only away from death for a little while longer. The last journeys begin without ceremony. No great migration gathers across the floodplains anymore. No towering silhouettes circle together above the river valleys, waiting for rising thermals beneath the warm Cretaceous sun. The skies that once carried giant pterosaurs across an entire continent have become empty stretches of gray ash, unstable wind, and fading light. And still, instinct keeps telling you to move. You launch weakly from a frozen ridge at dawn, while brittle grass cracks beneath your forelimbs. The takeoff hurts now. Not sharply, not dramatically. The pain arrives as heaviness. Muscles slower to respond, joints stiff from cold nights, damaged membranes pulling unevenly against the wind. Even the air feels older somehow. Below, the continent no longer resembles the world where you hatched. The vast wetlands of late Cretaceous North America are collapsing into scattered fragments. Rivers have narrowed into cold, muddy channels, winding through forests stripped bare by fire and darkness. Entire valleys remain silent for days at a time. The giant herds that once shaped the landscape through constant migration are mostly gone. Without them, the floodplains themselves seem to be dying. The ecosystem had depended on movement. Now, almost everything remaining survives by hiding instead. You glide low over a dead forest, where blackened conifers lean at strange angles above shallow snow collecting along the roots. Snow still feels unnatural. Even after weeks of colder temperatures, your instincts reject it. Your species evolved in warmth, humid floodplains, heavy rainstorms, air thick enough to support immense soaring bodies through rising thermals stretching across ancient river basins. But the atmosphere that built Quetzalcoatlus no longer exists. Perhaps that is why the extinction feels so quiet. People often imagine the end of prehistoric giants as violent, monsters collapsing beneath firestorms while the world explodes around them. Yet, the final disappearance of a species may usually happen in smaller moments instead. Failed nests, hunger, cold mornings, injuries that healed too slowly, empty skies where others once flew. A species can vanish gradually enough that no living individual ever realizes it is witnessing the end. You continue southward through weak air currents while ash drifts across the landscape below like gray fog. Some patches of vegetation are returning now in isolated regions. Hardy ferns spread through burned terrain faster than forests can recover. Small mammals move constantly beneath dead branches, searching for seeds, insects, and carrion. Tiny birds survive near surviving water sources. Life is rebuilding already, just not for creatures your size. That may have been the ultimate problem facing giant pterosaurs after the impact. Recovery favors fast reproduction, flexibility, and low energy requirements. Small animals rebound because they adapt quickly to shattered ecosystems. But Quetzalcoatlus depended on abundance spread across enormous territories. Giant flyers cannot survive on scraps for long. Your species belong to a world that no longer exists. The realization follows you through every empty mile of sky. By midday, weak sunlight finally penetrates the ash clouds enough to warm sections of exposed ground below. A few unstable thermals rise from the floodplain, allowing you to climb higher than you have managed in days. The sensation almost feels familiar for a moment. Air flowing properly beneath the wings, gravity loosening slightly, the continent stretching outward beneath you in silent distance. And suddenly you remember the breeding ridges, the humid mornings above endless wetlands, the giant shadows drifting across orange sunsets before the impact. For a brief instant, the memory feels more real than the world below. Then the thermal collapses. Your body drops abruptly through cold, unstable air, while sharp pain shoots along one wing joint. Recovery comes slower now. Every correction costs strength you no longer fully possess. you descend again toward the dead floodplain below, before exhaustion forces the landing. The impact rattles through your limbs. You remain still afterward for a long time. The older you become, the clearer one truth feels. Giant flight was always temporary. Not temporary within a lifetime, temporary within Earth's history itself. For millions of years, pterosaurs ruled skies no vertebrate had ever occupied before them. They survived mass extinctions, continental shifts, climate swings, and evolutionary competition across unimaginable spans of time. Some became fish hunters skimming ancient oceans. Others evolved into agile forest climbers. And eventually, forms like Quetzalcoatlus stretched the limits of powered flight almost beyond belief. But evolution does not protect greatness. It only rewards what works right now. And right now, the world no longer rewards giants. You walk beside a narrow river through dying reeds while cold wind moves across the empty basin around you. Walking has become easier than flying again, less painful, less risky. Perhaps that is fitting. Your life began on the ground long before the sky accepted your weight. And now it is returning there. The river smells strange. Not dead exactly. Young, fresh vegetation spreads along sections of the bank, untouched by fire. Small insects hover above the water surface during the warmest part of the afternoon. Somewhere nearby, tiny mammals chatter briefly beneath tangled roots before vanishing underground again. The future is already rehearsing itself around your extinction. That thought would mean nothing to you consciously, of course. You cannot imagine mammals inheriting the planet or birds diversifying across the empty skies left behind by pterosaurs. You cannot understand that 66 million years later, intelligent descendants of those tiny survivors will reconstruct your skeleton from fragments buried beneath stone and argue over how you lived. Yet the clues are already here. The survivors are small, quick, adaptable. They survive by flexibility instead of scale. As evening approaches, you climb one final ridge overlooking the remnants of the floodplain. The landscape spreads outward beneath dark clouds rolling slowly across the continent. Burned forests, frozen marshes, empty migration paths cutting through gray grasslands where giant herbivores once moved in endless numbers. And above it all, silence. No Quetzalcoatlus cross the horizon anymore. No distant calls echo through the dusk. You may be alone now, or close enough that the difference no longer matters. The wind strengthens slightly as darkness settles over the valley. Instinct stirs again inside your aging body, the old reflex pulling giant wings toward open air despite exhaustion, despite hunger, despite the cold world waiting beyond the ridge. One more flight. You spread your wings carefully against the evening sky. Even now, the structure remains astonishing. Membranes stretched across elongated fingers, hollow bones balancing impossible scale against gravity. A design so strange that tens of millions of years later, humans will still struggle to fully understand how it worked. Some scientists will argue Quetzalcoatlus soared elegantly across continents. Others will insist it spent more time walking than flying. Some will imagine naked reptilian skin. Others will reconstruct pycnofibers covering the body like primitive fur. Even your launch mechanics will remain debated, because extinction destroys behavior first. Bones survive. Movement disappears. The real animal vanishes long before fossils form. You leap from the ridge. For several seconds, gravity grips hard against your body, while cold wind rushes beneath the wings. Then the air catches properly one final time, and suddenly you are flying again. Not powerfully, not gracefully, but enough. Below, the darkened floodplains drift silently beneath fading twilight, while weak moonlight reflects along frozen river channels winding through the dead forests. The continent feels endless once more from this height, almost beautiful again beneath the ash-gray sky. For a moment, it becomes possible to imagine the old world still exists somewhere beyond the horizon. The warm rivers, the breeding grounds, the crowded skies of the late Cretaceous. But the illusion fades quickly. Your wings beat slower now. The air grows colder. And somewhere deep within the instincts that carried your species through millions of years of Earth's history, another truth finally settles into silence. This flight will not lead anywhere new, only into disappearance. Long after your final descent, long after soft tissues vanish and the floodplains harden into stone, fragments of your bones will remain buried beneath ancient sediment across what humans will someday call Texas. Paleontologists will uncover enormous vertebrae and wing bones so large they will initially seem almost impossible. Artists will paint you soaring above dinosaurs like a living myth. Scientists will debate your weight, your launch style, your hunting behavior, even the color of your skin. And perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate. Because Quetzalcoatlus belonged to one of the strangest moments in Earth's history, the final age when giant reptiles still ruled both land and sky, just before the world changed forever. Then eventually, even the fossils will fall silent, and above the empty floodplains of a vanished continent, the sky that once carried the largest flying animals in Earth's history will belong to smaller wings instead. Thank you for spending this journey through prehistoric Earth with me tonight. If you enjoyed this sleep documentary, don't forget to subscribe for more relaxing journeys into ancient worlds, lost creatures, and the mysteries of our planet.